So we are just so thrilled to have Alan Graham with us here today. We had actually been planning for this Sunday school class before the whole COVID-19 self-quarantine thing started to happen, to have him as a special speaker at the church. And when we reached out to say, hey, can we put this into a virtual presentation? Alan was glad to do that for us, and we're very, very grateful. Many of you may know Alan or know of him already. He is the founder and CEO of Mobile Loaves and Fishes, which is one of really the most well-known ministries here in Austin. It's one of WHPC's mission partners. And what Mobile Loaves and Fishes is it's an organization that aims to empower communities into a lifestyle of service with the homeless. And they've been doing that for over 20 years. For over 20 years, their volunteer-led food trucks have been serving men and women who are living on the street or otherwise in poverty. And Mobile Loaves is also the organization behind Community First Village, which is a planned community to give affordable permanent housing now for hundreds of people who are coming out of chronic homelessness. And none of this would have been possible without Alan's vision and the way that he continues to follow the Spirit's leading. None of this would be possible without the team and the organization that he has built. So we're just so happy to have him here to share specifically about Mobile Loaves, the issue of homelessness, and how his perspective has been shaped by what's going on currently. So as we look at the future of serving with, providing for people who are homeless, what does that look like even in light of COVID-19?
Yeah, no problem. Here we are. Is this all right?
Yeah. You were starting to talk about how when Tricia started taking the kids to church and that started to be something that they were doing versus what you were doing. I think that's when we started to lose you.
Okay. And well, that was pretty simple. And so I jumped on board and just started studying everything that I could possibly study to understand more about our faith, and fell in love with the church on an intellectual basis. But in 1996, I went on a men's retreat at my church at St. John Newman, where had I known that we were going to be holding hands with men, or God forbid, hugging it out, that bromance, hugging it out, I would have never gone to that. But what was incredible was that the deal started off with men holding hands and hugging it out. And, you know, for about 2 hours, I was extraordinarily uncomfortable. And then men would get up and give testimonies, and they would vomit out some of the most putrid, sinful stuff that you could ever imagine. The kind of stuff that I just wanted to go up and say, look, you should keep those things in the deepest, darkest recesses of your skeleton closet. But then they would all connect it to forgiveness, reconciliation, healing, and redemption. And it was 10 of these talks over 30 hours, and this forgiveness, reconciliation, healing, and redemption was just unfolding. And by the end of this, on a Sunday afternoon, I was just a different person. And what was intellectually in my brain just dropped to the floor into the depths of the cave of my heart. And that's when I began to ask God, what do you want me to do? You know, now, look, I had no intentions of leaving what was becoming a relatively successful commercial real estate development career. You know, all I wanted to do was be a lector, or, you know, cook barbecue for the Sunday afternoon church thing, or whatever. And but these little opportunities started coming my way. And in 1998, Tricia and I were having coffee with a girlfriend of ours, and she was telling us about a ministry in Corpus Christi, Texas, where on cold winter nights, multiple churches would come together, pool their resources to take out to the men and women that lived on the streets of Corpus Christi. And at that moment, sitting there, the image of a catering truck entered my mind as a distribution vehicle from those of us that have abundance to those that lack abundance. And for those that are on this call that are entrepreneurs, or those that are married to entrepreneurs, you know the risk of being around another entrepreneur with another idea. So I actually kind of withheld sharing this idea at that moment or with Trisha for a week or two. And finally, I got the courage to go to her because I had taken her on a nice roller coaster of entrepreneurial stuff over the course of our marriage. And so I told her, I said, sweetie, I've got this idea, the catering truck and that whole deal. And she just looked at me and said, oh my God, here we go again, in a very loving way. And then I began to share it with some friends, and we launched. We went out on the streets in the back of a buddy's green minivan on September 13th, 1998, to see whether we could go out there. And this was, what I kind of, in a fun way, call 6 white guys from Westlake Hills. And none of us had ever fed the homeless, knew who the homeless were. But it turned out that God had put into our lives a formerly chronically homeless, multi-time felon, heroin addict, alcoholic on our custodial staff at St. John Newman. And we, with all of our collective wisdom, said, well, maybe Houston could help us. And he did. He became our eyes and ears to the streets. It's as if Jesus himself walked in the form of a convicted felon, chronically homeless addict, in order to guide us to build this ministry. And there's much more that I could share about that deal, but it was actually pretty incredible. And that night, going out on the streets was so powerful that we knew that we were going to go and get that catering truck. And I tell you, it's just been fairly mind-blowing how God has blessed so many of us to be able to go out and connect human to human, heart to heart with the men and women on the streets, to begin to transform how you and I view the stereotype of the homeless. There were 3 things about that truck that we didn't understand. We see it in the rearview mirror now, but number one is that truck goes to where the people are, as opposed to herding the people to a soup kitchen. The centralized, consolidated, contained type of model. This model, you bounced all over the city to meet people where they are. Number 2, is that when the truck goes out, our fundamental spirit is a spirit of abundance. We believe that God is infinite and abundant. So let's not put limitations. Let's not live into a scarce mentality, which most nonprofits do. There's limited this, limited that. We don't believe that. We believe that the world is abundant, the kingdom is abundant. So let's do that. So we always put fresh and first quality store-bought food on the trucks. We weren't looking for leftovers. And then that allowed people to make a choice. And as opposed to just getting your food unit, you got to make a choice based upon the inventory that was on the truck. And then the third critically important thing is that those that were serving and those being served were on the same side of the serving counter. And so that created an intimate human to human, heart to heart connection. And I began to know people. I began to meet Claire out on the streets. And if I got to go to that spot again and Claire happened to be there, and I happened to say, hello, Claire, how are you doing? Claire would be stunned at first that I would remember her name. And then, that relationship begins to develop. And when relationships begin, our vulnerabilities open up. And when our vulnerabilities open up, that's when the kingdom really begins to open up for all of us. And then in 2003, actually in 2002, I got this idea that I wanted to go out on the streets and actually spend the night with my friends. And so in May of 2003, 17 years ago now, myself and about 14, 15 other people were dropped off into downtown, and we spent 3 nights on the streets, and it was incredibly powerful. I've done, I don't know. I've spent about 250 to 300 nights on the streets. Myself or the organization has probably shepherded 2,500 people with us on what we call a street retreat, a one-on-one retreat between you and God. It wasn't an effort to experience homelessness because we can't. And there's no point in trying to pretend when I can always get up off the streets and come back to my king size bed and house and all that. And that began an even deeper relationship. And this is when I began to realize that no one came from the holistic nuclear family type of deal, that there was a catastrophe, a nuclear bomb that was thrown into all of their families. And that's when I began to realize that the single greatest cause was a profound catastrophic loss of family, because every family that's on this Zoom call right now, with almost without exception, there might be an exception, has a drug addict, an alcoholic, or somebody that's battling a mental health condition in their family. We don't escape that. And somehow we managed to come up underneath that without letting our family members end up out on the streets. And so this also caused me to try to even dive deeper into, why are people homeless? You know, if they had a house, they would no longer be homeless, which is no longer true in my mind, because we have a phrase that housing will never solve homelessness, community will. But I began with that fundamental philosophy: how can we, in the most abundant country ever in the history of the world, have people living on the streets? That puzzled me. So in 2004, a buddy of mine, one of my co-founders, Bruce Agnes, called me up and said he was looking at purchasing a ranch in Fredericksburg. It's one of the reasons we now have a house in Fredericksburg, because of him, and wanted to know if I wanted to drive out with them to take a peek at this ranch. And I did. And when we got on the property, there was there was a deer camp, a deer lease, deal with an RV. And I jumped out of his truck and ran over to that RV and opened the door and looked inside. And I looked at Bruce and I said, brother, I could live in something like this. What do you think something like this would cost? And he says, I think you could buy these all day long for $3,000 to $5,000. And so we went out. I bought one in January of 2005 for $5,000. And in March of 2005, lifted a buddy of mine, Sam Cole, who still lives with us in the village, off of the streets into an RV park. And being the serial entrepreneur that I am, that's when I began to fantasize about building an RV park on steroids, and began to put that plan together. And I'm not going to go through all the details, but it was a struggle. We tried to partner with the city of Austin on that issue. That was a deep struggle. But ultimately, we got oriented toward this property out on Hogeye Road. Started with 27 acres. We now have we're about 95% occupied, with about 40 people living on that property. We purchased a few years ago the 24 acres next door. And by mid-June, we will be moving people in. That will add another 310 homes to the 225 homes that we now have. 2 weeks ago, we acquired a 51-acre tract of land across the street from the village, and another 76 acres out on Burleson Road. And so the future is shining very brightly for our ability to continue to do the work that we're doing. Now, when you look at Austin, Texas, and what's happened over the past year prior to COVID, and the escalation of the conversation of homelessness in our city related to overturning those ordinances, I've never seen an issue that elevated to the level that that issue elevated and sustained for as long a period of time as that issue was. And the only thing that stopped it in its track was this COVID thing that's going on. I can tell you that, in my humble opinion, we have to get people up off the streets and into a place that they can call home. And I believe that community first is one of the largest pieces of that puzzle, but not the only piece to that puzzle. That all of the things that we do here in the city, all the mental health, all the primary health care, all the feeding, including the mobile Loaves and Fishes stuff, all the shelters, is really and truly putting a Band-Aid on a carotid artery bleed until we pull people out of that environment into a community environment. Now, and there's been a lot that has formed our understanding that has put skin on the skeleton of our belief that the single greatest cause of homelessness is a profound, catastrophic loss of family. One of those was a book that was published in 2008 called Beyond Homelessness: Christian Faith and a Culture of Displacement. Highly recommend that book. And then if you don't want to read a book and you want to read a phenomenal article that was published in the March issue of Atlantic magazine, written by David Brooks, called "The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake." Powerful, powerful, powerful article describing this short-lived fantasy about the nuclear family that we had in the United States that really only lasted from about 1950 to 1965. This Leave It to Beaver, Ozzie and Harriet, and for those that are older, we know the Leave It to Beaver, Ozzie and Harriet deal. How really and truly that was a temporary fantasy, and that really what we need more than anything is a forged family. It's the family unit that is forged into the nuclear family, because within the nuclear family, all kinds of things happen. People die, people separate. It's just the nature of who we are. But when you have a strong forged family around that nuclear family, when the disasters happen, the forged family is capable of coming up underneath that. So I just super highly recommend reading that. It's about a 14-page article. You can download it. The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake by David Brooks. It would be a great almost Bible study, because it's biblical that the forged family is there to always support the nuclear family. And when the disasters happen inside the nuclear family, we have that structure that's around that deal. So I think what the city of Austin is lacking more than anything, because we live in moments of desperation and we're always seems to be very reactive to some of these profound cultural issues, as opposed to being responsive, sitting down and really thinking through what it is that we're doing, and understanding that where we are in our state of homelessness now, because of this profound catastrophic loss of family, took us decades, really generations, to get to this place. It's going to take us time to get out. And what I like to tell people all the time is, we're not in a hurry. I know we want to solve this problem out there on the street corner, but if we do it smartly, with an effective strategy. And again, I go back to community first. I think it's one of the larger pieces to that puzzle. And I can't wait for those that haven't been out there that's on this Zoom call. As soon as we can decrease the social distancing thing, which I think is fairly around the corner for us. Love to have you out and be able to share this beautiful place with you. The COVID-19 deal is very interesting. I will tell you that we have had 0 cases out in the village. Tricia and I live in the village, and 0 cases. I would appreciate everybody continuing to pray a protective veil over that village. I think there's a lot of reasons around that, and it doesn't ignore that someday we will. In fact, all the data that I'm hearing is a lot more people have had that dang virus than we actually realize, and nobody actually realized that they had that virus. So it'll be interesting to look back on this scenario. But we've put the village into a lockdown. Our neighbors have been extraordinarily responsive to that. I think one of the interesting things is that the village actually creates an environment for people to practice safe social distancing and stay at home, because people have a home that they can stay at home in. And when you live on the streets and you're yelling at people to stay at home and all they have is a 50, 60 square foot tent, nobody's going to stay inside there. I mean, most of us already have cabin fever already from what we're doing. We're trying to figure out how to bust out and go bike riding and walking. And I bet you most everybody on this call is already taking a few risks getting around people. And I love the ones that, you'll have the mask on, and you'll be talking to somebody and then you'll pull the mask down and talk to them, And so I'm sure, we're doing that. Mobile Loaves and Fishes, this is my 6th recession in my life to be in. I've never been in one that's come so quick, and I think this is going to be a deep one. Mobile Loaves and Fishes had a strategy in place for really 15 years that when economic downturns occur, what do you do? In fact, we review that strategy at least twice a year, and had just reviewed that strategy about 3 months prior to COVID entering. And so when it did, myself and my executive team were able to get around, and then we just started going down the list and doing all the things that we needed to do to, number 1, protect Mobile Loaves and Fishes. Number 2, protect our neighbors. We can't allow anything to happen to Mobile Loaves and Fishes, otherwise that would be a disaster for our neighbors. And so we feel great about the place that we're in. We're still monitoring the economy to see what impact that's going to have over the long term, but we believe that we're in a great place. And one of the reasons we're in a great place is because we have awesome partners like WHPC. So, and then we're optimistic, man. We're planning for the future. We have 125 acres, and that will be ready in about 2 years to start building. And, and if we're in this economic downturn for that period of time, we're going to come out in an extraordinary manner. And I'm like everybody out there. There's multiple ways of processing. I'm listening to all kinds of data and podcasts and epidemiologists and physicians and economists, and dang it, I'm just confused. So we'll continue responding to what's out there, yet questioning whether it required this level of response. I don't know. And I hope that we're going to be looking back on this sometime relatively soon and going, the next time this happens, we're going to be able to respond in a different way. Obviously, right now is a time of deep introspective time for all of us. I'm sure everybody is trying to figure out what's most important, what's most valuable in life. All of us have skirted with the reality that, God, if we ended up with that disease, if we're over 60, what does it mean? If we're over 70, what does it mean? If we're over 80, what does it mean? If we end up in the ICU on a ventilator. I mean, these are all conversations that we've certainly been having here. But I think the ultimate sign is that I think God is calling us to be courageous. And when you look at, when Moses led the people out of Egypt, they had no idea really where they were going. And all they were told was to follow the pillar of fire. And then they, had to cross this treacherous parting river. They had to be frustrated by temptation. And then I think, and fast forward to the disciples of Christ, I think about Mary, this young woman that probably witnessed some of the greatest courage ever on the planet, because the angel came to her and said, "Hey, man, you're going to be the bearer of the Messiah." And her only question was, "How is this going to happen? Because I have not been with man." And she and the angel responded that the power of the Holy Spirit will come upon you. She didn't ask a bunch of questions. She didn't go, "Well, I'm not married. What's it going to be like that? And then, is Joseph going to want to marry me now? And then, am I going to have to go back to Nazareth or Bethlehem to be counted? And then, what happens when the king realizes there's a Messiah and wants to kill the?" She was just courageous and stepped out there, and the disciples did the same thing. Without a lot of questioning. So I think in a lot of ways we're called to be cautious, but at the same time courageous with where we're headed. Anyway, how about we open it up for some questions?
That sounds good. Thank you so much, Alan. So a couple of things have come in, and I'm just going to go ahead and link that Atlantic article. So you all, if you want to make reference to that article that Alan mentioned, the one about the nuclear family, I'm just going to drop that into the chat. So copy it and save it if you want to. But Debbie Johnson raised an interesting question. Just wondering, you made reference a couple of times, Alan, to knowing that Community First Village was going to be a big part or a piece of Austin's response to homelessness. And she asked, which pieces of the puzzle does Community First not solve, or what do you see some of those other pieces maybe as being in a full-fledged response to homelessness?
Yeah, and so Mobile Loaves and Fishes is singularly focused on the chronically homeless, and these, by definition, this is an unaccompanied male or female, no children, with a disabling condition, and that disabling condition could be physical, mental, or addiction. Having lived on the streets for at least 1 year in the Austin area, are episodically homeless, adding up to a year over a 3-year period of time. Now, in the village, the average age of our neighbors is 58 years old. The average time on the streets is 10 years. The average age of death is just under 60. And so we're going after the most vulnerable people on the streets. We don't do women and children, so that's a piece of the puzzle that's out there. We don't do prisoners exiting the prison system, but many of our people, probably the overwhelming majority, have felony criminal histories, but they've been homeless on the streets. We don't do families that are living in their automobiles in the Walmart parking lot. We don't, when you look at the median family income as defined by HUD in all of our different cities, there are people that are in the 80% MFI, 60%, 30% MFI. We're really at the 0 to 15%, the poorest of the poor. And then when you think about our model of the chronically homeless and how vulnerable they are, there's a point in time where they need assisted living. We're not an assisted living place, but we're far more assisted living than what I ever thought that we would be, because this began with the idea that people could live independently here. But it turns out that there are so many disabilities, physical, mental, and addiction, and we've been able to put structure around that. But there does come a point when people are not, say, physically capable of taking care of themselves, and there needs to be places. And one of my favorite organizations in town is Family Elder Care, and I would like to see our city come up underneath Family Elder Care, who are dealing with the poorest of the elder care population, who live on extremely fixed incomes. That would be very helpful. The addict, depending on the addict, we have a lot of addicts that live in the village. The overwhelming vast majority live peacefully within the village, but every now and then, we have those that are very difficult. So there's just a number of little pieces to that puzzle that I think, but the biggest piece of that puzzle, the largest population, are those chronically homeless. I hope that answered that question.
Thanks, Alan. I think it is really important for us to continue thinking about the way all of these different issues interlace. I mean, from addiction to disability to mental health, and other ways that urban poverty can work for families and that kind of thing. Thank you. Just a couple more here, and they're kind of related. So Mike Irvin has asked, how supportive do you find the city and or Travis County is in your planning? And kind of connected to that, Channing Weiss has asked, do you regularly interact with city officials on policy for homeless neighbors? So very curious about maybe your relationship with the city and county, and just what's that like?
Well, 100% of our capital and operations has all been privately funded. We're privately funded. I believe in a spiritual context. In my Roman Catholic faith, there's a social construct called subsidiarity, and in Calvinist thinking, it's called sphere sovereignty. And so, in a very simple way, it basically says when there's profound human issues, that the government should only play a subsidiary role to you and I in mitigating these, and should only come into play in a heavy way if we don't. And I think there has been, particularly in America, an abdication of caring for the most vulnerable in our community to the government. And what we want to do is take back that ownership as the kingdom of God, because we think it's one of the blessings that Christ has blessed us with. And so we are a very Christocentric ministry. We don't proselytize, so we welcome everybody. So every walk of life comes out onto that property. And but I always want people to know that I'm a Jesus lover, but I'm not trying to command people, and nobody's allowed within our organization to proselytize. We're commanded to love. And that's what we do. And so it's difficult, and particularly into this city, which isn't as inclusive as its progressive nature would allude. And so we're trying to encourage the city to be more inclusive, to welcome more people at the banquet table of inclusion and not to exclude people from that. And so they struggle, honestly, with our faith. And but look, we're open to accepting government money and support if it's the same way. It's like, when you look at the amount of financial support, much less human capital we've received from Westlake Hills Presbyterian, you don't, your strings are limited. You just want me. So if you're gonna do a Christmas Eve deal to underwrite 2 homes, your expectation is we're gonna build 2 homes, and that's what we'll do. But you don't come in and layer a bunch of other strings like the government would do. The government also struggles very deeply with innovation and entrepreneurial ways. They're an extraordinarily in the box model. In fact, the national model is a model called Housing First. We're not opposed to Housing First, but how can one have only one way of addressing an issue that has so many different facets to that issue? And so, we've got good relationships with the city and the county, and in our planning process, they're all involved, and they do fee waivers and lots of things like that. But they also know that because of their in the box way of operating, it's better for them to allow us to do our out of the box way, because we can move the needle faster than they can. Like, I'll tell you right now, we're still laser focused on homelessness. Our city, as of March, ceased its laser focus on homelessness. And if you would have seen the debacle that had unfolded in terms of how we care for the people that are still on the streets, and the few of us organizations that came around and went and just demanded that the city help, and finally they started doing that because we were clanging a pretty loud gong. But the issue of homelessness is just not number one on their radar screen right now. And hopefully it'll return.
Thanks, Alan. I think in the interest of time, there have been a couple more questions that have come in that I might try to ball up into one. But sort of questions about preventative measures, thinking about what happens in a catastrophic loss of family, what drives people to go to the streets, and to not have a place that's stable to live. What preventative measures have you noticed as being best?
Yeah, that's a complex question. That I think reading that article will help understand how complex this is going to be for us for a while. I think it's all about the forged family. And I think it's all about understanding how disconnected we have become in our community. I raised my family in Westlake Hills on Redbud Trail. We were there 34 years. It was a profoundly rooted environment for Trish and our children. But we were disconnected from all of our neighbors. We didn't really know our neighbors. Yes, I had community at St. John Newman, and I had community through Mobile Loaves and Fishes, but there wasn't really a community around that. And I think all of us experience that in the neighborhoods that we live in. We kind of know our neighbors, but we really, really don't. And then, 3.5, 4 years ago, Trish and I just started staying out at the village a bit in a 400 square foot little home that was part my office, because we would be out there with, late afternoon, early evening meetings, and then we would drive back to Westlake and come back out early the next morning for the next meeting. And we just, why don't we spend the night tonight? And, and then, that was one time. And then the next week, it was two times. And then pretty quick, 3.5 years ago, it turned into full time. And the house that I thought that I would die in, we decided to sell. Because in my neighborhood now, the Community First Village, everybody. You're in the middle of everybody's business, and they're in your business. And it's an interesting transition. I mean, I know all my drug addicts. I know the alcoholics. I know the people that are, I can walk down the street, and if I see somebody without their mask on, I'll get that mask on, man. Did you wash your hands? And it's, when they're high, I walk up to them and say things like, hey, man, I know what you're doing right now. I want you to know I love you. And I know that you really don't want to be doing this. And none of them do. And when you're ready to get out of that behavior, let us know, because we can help you. And so it's a very powerful relational place. I'm also, I've encountered every walk of life that you could ever imagine, which allows us to move deeper into who the human person is, and in essence, create a forged family. I feel more protected in a community full of crack addicts, glue sniffers, convicted felons, prostitutes than I've ever felt anywhere else. I don't feel judged in that environment. And if anybody was to ever attack me, they'd have probably an army of 235 people coming after them. It's just hard to explain. So I think to return, we've got to somehow get out of our hermetically sealed single family sarcophaguses that we call the American dream. And most of our neighborhoods are, we're just isolated from each other. So, but it's bigger, complex. That article will help alliterate some of those issues, but man, it's a complex deal.
Well, thank you, Alan. I'm aware of what time it is. Thank you for spending this time with us. Just in this last part that you've been speaking, you've made me think a lot about the way Jesus frames the command to love neighbor as self. Of all the words that he could have used, he could have said other people, he could have said your friends, your family, but said to love neighbor. And part of what I heard you saying about kind of your past life in Westlake was almost like it was just about the family, and the neighbors were already a ways away. And what I see you doing is almost re-endowing, refilling that term neighbor with meaning and discovering something there. And I'm hopeful that this past month or so that we've all been in, it maybe has some of that same effect. I've heard a lot of folks in our congregation talk about basically reaching out to their neighbors and being better neighbors and getting to know their up close community. I live in an apartment complex in South Austin. I'll say I know the names of several more of my neighbors now than I did 6 weeks ago. And I think it just has to do with the moment we're in. And that's one of my favorite things about the village, being out there too, is just I think you call it human to human and heart to heart, and we talk about it on truck runs. Like the first thing you ask someone on a truck run is, what's your name? Before you start, helping load a bag full of sandwiches, you have to establish that. And I just thank you for the reminder of the importance of that. Thank you for your time with us today, for your patience with us as we've dealt with some of the technological side of things. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. At this point, we will just send you on your way. Thank you so much for being with us, Alan. And I know that some of our folks from the regular Sunday school class might want to stay on the Zoom call for a little while just to chat and have visiting time. So feel free to do that if that's you and you feel led. But thank you again so much, Alan. We're looking forward to talking to you again soon. Looking forward to whenever our WHPC microhome build can take place. We're just, we're all along all along for the ride on that one. But we just are so thrilled to be in partnership. Thank you for sharing your day with us.
Yeah, awesome. Thank y'all.
All right,
You have
peace.
a great day. Bye bye.